I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week we're joined by the writer Ian Frazier to discuss his new book, Paradise Bronx, The Life and Times of New York's Greatest Borough. But first, the bar was set low for both candidates in this week's debate. One candidate hurdled it, while the other, by most accounts, did not. Former President Donald Trump let the debate get away from him and doubled down on the inflammatory rhetoric he's known for, perhaps further alienating middle ground voters. Here to discuss what the debate means for the campaign going forward, New York Times Deputy Opinion Editor Patrick Healy. Patrick, it's good to have you here and good to know that you're writing again at the Times as well. You wrote recently, "A debate changes things in an instant. Just ask Joe Biden." What did this debate change?
I think it showed, Sam, that Donald Trump at age 78 is so capable of being baited and led around a stage like the way that Vice President Kamala Harris did, that I know in talking to some undecided voters in a focus group right after the debate, it gave them enormous pause. What would this guy be like when he goes up against Vladimir Putin again? What would he be like against China? Are we going to go back to kind of this sort of the same old personality politics? I think one voter said to me, and it surprised me, Sam, it'll surprise you too, that Donald Trump has been so under the radar for the last 3.5 years that this voter had forgotten what Trump was like and the way that flattery and fawning and manipulation can work on the guy. So I think it was revealing about that. I think a lot of voters are still getting to know Kamala Harris. I think as we know, quite a few were sort of impressed with her kind of command of the debate. But Sam, what we heard over and over again in these focus groups and reader responses to our coverage was people felt like, I still don't really know how she would be different than Joe Biden. I don't like this economy, the way that it's been going for the last 3.5 years. What would she do differently? That's still a hurdle for her.
And it seemed like a big point that Trump could have scored more points on by saying, all these things you want to do, why haven't you done them in the past 3.5 years?
I totally agree, Sam. That first question in the debate was actually probably Harris's worst answer when the debate moderator said, oftentimes people ask, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? What have you done over the last 3.5 years? Why should people feel good about where they are today? And she started talking about her biography and growing up middle class. It was a very weak answer if you reread it. And Trump had an opportunity, and those first few minutes of debate are so important. He really could have lowered the boom. He's just not capable of that. He in some ways believes too much in his own sense of self and grievance and kind of worldview to take opportunity. It's interesting, Sam, though, right after that, she did give the better answer, which when she said, look, in 2021, we inherited the Trump economy and it was a disaster. She was able to do a little more, but still, Sam, Kamala, I have never, and I'm curious how you see it, I have never seen a candidate like Kamala Harris who has won more news cycles over the last 7 weeks, who has had so many good days, so much incredible fundraising, so much social media excitement from the base, and yet is still tied or even a little behind against one of the most historically unpopular presidents. And it just raises a question, joy is not a political strategy. What does she need to do else?
Well, what does she need to do? After the convention, a bump in the polls and then sort of stagnated a bit. After the debate, presumably a bump too, but she can't afford to stagnate given the fact that everything is so close. So what happens from here on in? We only have about 8 weeks between now and the election.
I think what a lot of voters want is what you could call like the full Kamala. They want her out kind of everywhere. They want her just going, 12-hour days, doing events, doing news conferences, doing the hot ones, doing The View, being in a lot of different kinds of spaces, not just talking and introducing herself, but talking more about the economy. Look, Sam, the hardest thing that she has to do, but we hear this from a lot of swing voters, people who voted for Trump and then Biden, undecided voters, is they want her to speak very frankly about Bidenomics and the Biden economy. They want her to recognize that what they've done over the last 3.5 years hasn't made people feel like they can easily pay the rent or pay groceries. Gas prices are what they are, they're going down. But they still feel like they don't really know or trust her on what she's talking about with the economy. The only other thing I'd say, Sam, and this is something we talk about in the newsroom and opinion, in 2022 and 2023, a lot of elections were won on abortion rights. It was very powerful as a motivator. You got historic turnout in places like Ohio and Kansas. Is there a path for her in some of these states if she was to lean even more into that trust question about, can you really trust Donald Trump and J.D. Vance not to sign a national abortion ban? Can
Something
you really
that
trust them?
Trump would not deny in the debate.
He would not deny, and Trump has been flip-flopping on this, frankly, more than the first candidate who I covered who got tagged as a flip-flopper, John Kerry, in 2004. I will say, Sam, in the focus group with undecided voters last night, I asked them, what have you changed your mind on the most over the last month? What one thing? The thing that the majority of them brought up, and that was a little surprising to me, was J.D. Vance. A lot of them felt, oh, J.D. Vance, interesting guy, young, charismatic, really well-spoken, interesting pick. I was really surprised. And some of these people are pretty conservative. They really had soured on him. They just thought, this guy is extreme. I don't know what he would do if he got into office. Would he represent people like me? There's an opening there for her.
How could anyone be undecided at this point?
It's such a good question, Sam. I asked that as well. Here's the thing. These are the voters that we talk to, the voters we hear from. People who do not want to vote for Donald Trump. They do not want, they want almost permission not to vote for Donald Trump again. A lot of them, especially young voters, and this is interesting, Sam, a lot of them were just horrified by January 6th. A lot of people were, but especially young people who hadn't seen, sadly, you know, they've had tough lives in a lot of ways since 9/11 and the Great Recession, growing up in a pretty tough America. But January 6th horrified them. But so people who don't want to vote for Trump, but they don't know her well enough. And just as we saw in 2016, late breaking voters, people who were torn between Hillary, who they knew, and Trump, who they didn't know. A lot of them broke for Trump at the end. I think a lot of these undecided voters, they still want Harris to close the deal with them. And maybe at the end, you know, maybe they will break late for her, sort of the less known, frankly, candidate than Trump, who they know very well, just like they broke for Trump kind of toward the end in 2016.
Pat, I was talking to, a Harris supporter yesterday who was complaining about the Times' even-handed coverage, he said, in the news pages, saying we're bending over backwards to be nice to Trump. What about on the editorial pages? When we looked at our columnists, when we looked at the observers at the debate, we could barely find anyone who thought Trump did well. Are we making enough of an effort to find Trump supporters to balance the opinion on the op-eds on the opinion pages?
Yeah, I mean,
or can't we find enough people? I mean, there must be half the country likes him.
Sam, it's so interesting. We find that columnists like Bret Stephens and David French and Ross Douthat, who are kind of right of center, let's say, many of our readers love them, in some ways love them the most, because they challenge a lot of our readers who might be more left of center. So we find there's real interest in those stories. You know, there might be some people who would sit back and say, oh God, if the New York Times publishes, you know, something that helps you understand, you know, the MAGA base more, you know, you'll get the rain of fire, you know, cast down on you. But we don't find that with readers. I think they do like to be challenged. So I do think that is kind of incumbent on us, because we get a lot of guest essays that come over the transom from people on the left. We don't get a lot from Republicans. We often are going out. I've commissioned and landed guest essays in recent months from Liz Cheney, Kellyanne Conway, Lindsey Graham, Rich Lowry. Some of those have been well received, some of them weren't. You know, Rich Lowry wrote a guest essay, the editor of the National Review, a couple weeks ago, where the headline was, I think, "Trump can win on character." Boy, a lot of people didn't like that piece. Now, that's not going to inhibit us from doing those pieces, but I do think part of our mission is to help readers understand that there are a lot of Americans who don't feel like Trump is the abomination that they might, and who may need to see that a lot of Americans don't understand who Kamala Harris is. They don't know enough about her yet to trust her.
That's
Part
why
of that's
it was
character.
called the op-ed page.
Part of it's the op-ed page, Sam. You want that diversity of opinion, and I think our readers really reward us for that. When we land pieces that aren't hacky, you know, or aren't partisan for the sake of partisan, but help them understand ideas and arguments that pull back the curtain, that go, I think, deeper into how Americans who may not be their neighbors live and think.
Patrick Healy, Deputy Opinion Editor of the New York Times. Thank you for joining us. And coming up next, Bronx History with the acclaimed author Ian Frazier. Our next guest is known for his meticulous research, engaging storytelling in his books and in The New Yorker. Ian Frazier's latest book, Paradise Bronx, The Life and Times of New York's Greatest Borough. It's a love letter to an often misunderstood place that we all think we know about. Let me read you this excerpt from a review in the Wall Street Journal by Ed Kozner. He said, "The Bronx has none of the glamour of neighboring Manhattan, true Gotham in the minds of out-of-towners, nor the polyglot rambunctiousness of Brooklyn, the faux suburban sheen of Queens, or the tight little island sensibility of Staten Island." Ian, what does the Bronx have?
Well, it's, as I say kind of at the beginning of the book, it's the part of New York City where the New York City islands attach to the continent. And so it was called the continent before it even had any name at all. Back when the Dutch came here, it was referred to as the mainland. And I'm from the mainland myself, a lot farther west. I'm from Ohio. But that really appealed to me, the fact that this was the place where all of the kind of excitement of New York and all the kind of things that are going on in the city merge into the continent itself and merge into the U.S. And so for me, that was a big attractor. And also, as you said, people don't know that much about it, and often what they know about it is wrong. So it's a challenge to tell people about this place.
What's wrong about the common knowledge about the Bronx?
Well, people remember it from, they tend to remember it from its very low point back in the 70s and early 80s when it was on fire. I mean, the South Bronx was burning, you know, in 1976, 33,000 buildings burned in the Bronx, or 33,000 fires burned in the Bronx. And that's what people remember sometimes. And then they remember things that are just caricatures like Fort Apache, the Bronx, or you know, these ideas that this is a place of some kind of urban collapse, which it definitely is not. And even at the time, the impression that people had was just, I mean, if you said to anybody, well, you know, 1 million plus people live here, 1 million plus working people, or many of them working people who work in other boroughs, live here. Just take the subway in the morning and see who's on the subway at 6 o'clock in the morning. You know, there's a lot of people who live here, work every day or going to work, and whatever, you know, idea that you might have of this being some dysfunctional place, it's just mistaken.
You marveled at the change on Charlotte Street, which Jimmy Carter looked at when he was president, and it was a vast wasteland.
Right.
What is it like now?
Well, Charlotte Street is an interesting rebuilding, example of rebuilding in the Bronx, because Jimmy Carter, when he came here, in 1977 did a drive-through of the Bronx and went to Charlotte Street and got out, and it was a brave thing for a president to do because he just stood there looking at it, and it was just rubble as far as the eye could see. And when they had a number of different plans how to rebuild it, and because Carter had drawn attention to this place, it had to be rebuilt. And what they ended up doing was making it like a suburb. So it's now ranch houses with picket fences and, you know, flowering cherry trees in the yard. And it's almost, it's quite unexpected. And yet it worked. I mean, it was a way, you had to rebuild this, it had to work, and it has worked. And when Koch opened the, you know, when he announced that this was happening and was at the site, and somebody said, well, this will all fall apart in no time. And Carter said, the people that, or Koch said, the people that own these houses will defend them with their lives. And that has, I mean, some of the original owners still own houses there. This has been there for a while, but it's a really interesting, different place, the Charlotte Street area.
One of the heroes, or the hero of the rebuilding, you say, was Bronx Borough President Fernando Ferrer.
Fernando Ferrer had all kind. He just is, I think, an ingenious person, and I think he has really good ideas of. In this case, with the rebuilding, he had a good idea of how to get money for the Bronx. And what he did was, he said, we will start by rebuilding along the Cross Bronx Expressway. That is, the appearance is really important. Mm-hmm. And he came up with this project called the Gateways Project. And he had his staff photograph all the buildings along the Cross Bronx that were derelict. And he said, we're going to fix those buildings up. And he made a big presentation about it, and then he sort of let the city come to him. And this was at a time, by then the city did have some money to spend, and a lot of it went to the Bronx, and that was because of his ingenuity.
One of the things that Alexandra Jacobs wrote in the New York Times book review mm-hmm. was she said it was surprising that you omitted the famous epigram by Ogden Nash, "The Bronx no thunks." Why was that?
It's because I don't like it.
Well, that's a good reason. That's the best reason.
I think everybody knows that one. And I kind of alluded to it in the early, first couple pages
You
of the
came
book.
up with your own.
Well, I said, the name Honks. And there I wanted to kind of allude to the fact that the highways and the cars and the vehicles going through the Bronx have been its big problem. I mean, have really damaged it.
The Bronx, it honks, you said.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, that may still disturb Robert Moses, right? Who
yeah.
divided the Bronx with the Cross Bronx Expressway.
Pushed the Cross Bronx Expressway pushed it through just like a military road or something. And he's now buried in a columbarium, or barium, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, in the northwest corner of Woodlawn Cemetery. And 233rd Street is a softball toss away, and an off-ramp from the Major Deegan is there. And so there are traffic jams up there, and Robert Moses gets to hear honking for all eternity.
There is some justice, no? You wrote that the past bleeds through the present in the Bronx. What did you mean by that?
Well, everything you see, you assume is as it has always been. And then if you step back and you say, but what was here? I refer to a Parks Department marker that right next to the Cross Bronx Expressway that says, what was here before? And I think people, at least it's something I always do, is I look and then I try and see it in terms of how did we get here? What was the kind of, as if you could do kind of a motion capture all the way back to the beginning of settlement in the Bronx. And there are a lot of places where the Bronx, I think, was created in many respects, by literature. That is, there was a poem written in the early 19th century by Joseph Rodman Drake, and it was written to the Bronx River. And the poem is titled Bronx. And if you read that and then you look at the Bronx River, which has been another great story of restoration in the Bronx, and you look at it and then you can see, wow, this was an idyllic place. This was like something where Wordsworthian poets would sit and think about. And it's very easy kind of, because the river is the river, and it's still, I think, quite beautiful. And so there you can see, well, this has always been like this. And the things that have always been really fascinate me. I somehow, to know that something has always been, there's something intriguing about that.
You drew a connection between the British cannon firing at George Washington and hip-hop. You said what Kool Herc was playing was not only the loudest music Grandmaster Flash had ever heard, it was the loudest sound he had ever heard. Yeah. How did hip-hop develop in the midst of everything else going wrong in the Bronx?
Well, hip-hop is a huge subject, but I would say basically hip-hop is the combination of West Indian dance culture that used mammoth speakers and African-American music, R&B, even doo-wop, all kind of came together in this place, and so much damage had been done. I think the fact that so many people at the time that hip-hop was invented, which is in the early 70s, had moved out by then, that people didn't care if you turned the music way up. So you could have a jam in a park, hook your gigantic speakers up to the street lights, turn them up, and then the street lights would dim, and just blast this music up to the heavens, you know. And the police kind of let those jams go. They just said, well, this is a lot better than other stuff that's happening here. And so it was a place, I think the Bronx invented hip-hop as a response, in a way, to the Cross Bronx Expressway, you know. All these things were done to us. Now we're going to tell you what it's like. It's like,
talk about change. You said that Paradise Bronx, as it was metaphorically, did not end when blacks and Puerto Ricans started moving in. More the opposite. With their arrival, it became even better. In what way? That's sort of a contrarian view.
It is, but I say it's important to say, because people will kind of think, well, that's when things started to go downhill. It's not. It became better in terms of the music. It became better in terms of just the diversity of the Bronx. I mean, Gouverneur Morris High School was the most integrated school in the United States. And just kind of in terms of sports, New York City playground basketball, which totally changed basketball in the 60s, flourished in the Bronx. And all of this was, I think, you wouldn't have had if you hadn't had first the Great Migration and black people, mostly from the South, and then lots and lots of Puerto Rican people coming from Puerto Rico. And they, you know, people say Puerto Rican immigrants. No, they're not immigrants, they're citizens. Let's make that clear. So that both of those just enriched it.
So it keeps changing, and yet it's rooted in history. Ian Frazier, the book is titled Paradise Bronx, The Life and Times of New York's Greatest Borough, now available in bookstores and, of course, online. Coming up next, my thoughts on getting reelected. If you think the 2024 presidential race has been unpredictable, just wait until next year's mayoral campaign. As Politico New York noted, if Andrew Cuomo decides to run for mayor, his white knight's armor as a good governor, notwithstanding the reasons he had to resign, has now been tarnished by a substantive policy embarrassment. Cuomo was lionized nationally for how he handled the COVID pandemic. This week, for the first time, he was interrogated on the apparent undercount of deaths in nursing homes and his controversial order requiring that nursing homes not turn away COVID-positive patients. Cuomo called the House subcommittee hearing partisan. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik fulfilled his prophecy. "It's the reason why you're the former governor of New York State," she said. "You will never hold elected office again." California Congressman Raul Ruiz, the senior Democrat on the panel, said, though, that the panel wasn't playing politics. Ruiz said, quote, "Any public official who sought to obscure transparency or misled the American people during the COVID pandemic should answer to the American public, regardless of political party." Cuomo sort of said he was sorry. He said, "I believe you were owed an apology because I believe this country should have done better." What about the state? Meanwhile, no other mayoral administration than this one has been tainted by scandals since Ed Koch was mayor, and his phone wasn't seized by the FBI. Mayor Adams himself hasn't been accused of any wrongdoing, but the cadre of people around him now under suspicion is troubling, including his own police commissioner. That's particularly embarrassing for Adams, a former cop. Polls also show the mayor is unpopular. I wouldn't discount race as one reason, but there are other factors too. You never know, though. Remember Jimmy Walker. He was forced to quit as mayor in 1932 because of scandal. Walker was so beloved, though, that according to polls, had he run again, he would have been reelected in a landslide. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts, and don't forget to download CUNY TV's new smartphone app, where you can catch our conversations on the go, anytime, anywhere.